The Gilded Mirror Part 1. The puppet's last night, the sharp shatter of a crystal glass sliced through the soft jazz lingering in the air. Rich, red Cabernet splashed violently, dripping down Maya's flawless cheekbone. In the middle of the breathtaking Manhattan Gala, surrounded by the old money elites of the Upper East Side, she stood frozen, holding Isla Vanderbilt's humiliating slap with a smile that was terrifyingly calm. Before the crowd could whisper, a pair of strong, freezing fingers gripped Maya's wrist, pulling her into the shadow of the dimly lit corridor, away from the paparazzi's flashing lights. It was Julian Sterling, a cold-blooded hedge fund billionaire who believed everything in life could be managed by metrics and orders. But right now his chest heaved. His breath was ragged. He pinned her against the marble wall, his voice a lethal whisper. "Are you out of your mind? You're going to ruin everything." Maya didn't flinch. Her deep, resilient eyes stared straight through his $10,000 Brioni suit, piercing the darkest, loneliest corner of his soul. "Tomorrow, the second the wedding is over, you disappear forever. That was our deal," Julian growled, his threat dripping with desperation. As the wine continued to trace a bloody path down her chin, Maya tilted her head, whispering softly, "Julian, are you afraid of me disappearing tomorrow? Or are you terrified of going back to being an abandoned, lonely child?" The words were soft as a breath, but cut like a razor. Julian froze. His sharp, handsome face tightened, stripped bare of his billionaire armor. He, a man who controlled the fate of Wall Street, was trembling before a cleaning girl. Slowly, his tight grip loosened, only to lace his fingers through hers in absolute desperation. He pressed his lips close to her ear, breathing heavily. "Shut up. Tomorrow is tomorrow. But tonight, you are still mine." Part 2. The world of trash. No one at that gala knew that just 30 days ago, the girl in the silk gown was nothing but a janitor from the Bronx. The ICU monitor beeped a cold, steady rhythm in the sterilized air of a New York public hospital. Maya sat motionless by the bed, holding 18-year-old Chloe's frail hand. Her little sister was in a deep coma after a hit and run, and her life was being measured by the dollar signs ticking on the life support machines every single hour. Maya looked down at her faded gray jumpsuit, smelling of floor stripper and bleach. She was a cleaner. Every day, she wiped away the filth and leftovers of the ultra-rich inside Manhattan skyscrapers. "Hey, trash girl, are you deaf? Clean this up," her supervisor yelled, pointing at a spilled latte on the marble floor. He was taking out his own miserable day on her. Her co-workers looked away in shame, but Maya didn't. She walked over with her mop. She didn't look at his polished leather shoes. She looked at his hands, which were visibly shaking as he tried to stuff fake expense receipts into his pocket. Maya didn't get angry. She knew he wasn't mad about the coffee. He was terrified because he was embezzling corporate funds and knew he was one audit away from being thrown onto the streets. His aggression was just a paper mask covering a coward. She cleaned the floor quietly, keeping her dignity intact, standing a foot taller than his insults. But dignity couldn't pay the $50,000 medical bill hanging over Chloe's head. Late that night, as Manhattan lit up, Maya stood inside the penthouse office of Sterling Towers. Julian Sterling was standing by the glass window, his back turned to the world. Maya didn't knock. She pushed the heavy glass door open, holding her sister's medical files. A deal with the devil never begins with begging. It begins when the person at the bottom of the world dares to look the ruler in the eye and read his loneliness. Part 3. The Wall Street devil. Julian didn't turn around. His eyes remained locked on the infinite sea of New York lights 60 stories below. "The security in this tower is getting worse. Or you have a talent for trespassing." Julian's voice was low, cold as a bank vault. "I'll give you 10 seconds to get out before I press the silent alarm." Maya walked straight to his massive mahogany desk and dropped the medical files right next to his crystal glass of scotch. 10 seconds is more than enough for you to realize I'm the only one who can get you out of your arranged marriage with Isla Vanderbilt without tanking your stock by a single percent. Julian paused. He turned around slowly. The amber ceiling light caught the sharp, sculpted lines of his face. His icy gaze swept over her stained jumpsuit, stopping at her eyes. A mocking smile touched his lips. "A cleaning girl, smelling of bleach, thinks she has the leverage to negotiate a billionaire marriage with me? You need money. How much?" He pulled out a sleek fountain pen and his checkbook. To him, every problem had a price tag. I need $50,000 to save my sister, Maya said flatly. But I'm not here for a handout. I'm here for a trade. You need a wild card to break the Vanderbilt family's grip. I will play your long-lost sister. I will step into the Upper East Side and make Ethan Thorne, Isla's target, turn his head. Julian dropped his pen with a dull thud. He walked over, closing the distance until Maya could smell the expensive cedarwood cologne on his suit. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. Do you know the rules of this world, sweetheart? One slip up, and they will skin you alive. My money can buy you a $10,000 dress, but it can also bury you if you dare cross me. He tapped the checkbook against her chest, a dominant, defining gesture. Maya didn't back down an inch. She looked into his deep, empty eyes and smiled. You can buy the dress, Julian. You can buy the media's silence. But are you sure you're rich enough to buy the truth? You control the world because you're terrified of the things you can't buy. I'll be your puppet, but don't expect me to follow your script. The air in the room froze. No one on Wall Street had ever dared to tell Julian Sterling he was terrified. His chest tightened. A strange sensation, half fury, half intense fascination, surged through him. He stared at her for a few long seconds, then signed the check with a sharp flick of his wrist. 50 grand is wired to the hospital. My driver picks you up at 5 a.m. tomorrow. From that moment on, you are no longer Maya the cleaner. Welcome to a gilded hell. Part 4. Torture in Silk at 5 a.m., a black limousine carried Maya away from the Bronx. Destination, the Sterling Estate, a secluded, sprawling mansion in upstate New York, a fortress built on old money rules. Waiting for her in the grand foyer was Madame Gable, the head housekeeper. A woman in her 50s, wearing a sharp gray suit buttoned to the neck, her hair pulled back into a flawless, unforgiving bun. She threw a pair of black, pointed stiletto heels onto the floor. Put them on. They're one size too small for your feet, Madame Gable said, her voice devoid of human warmth. Maya silently slipped her feet into the shoes. Agony instantly shot through her legs. Her toes were crushed so tightly they felt ready to bleed. She stood up, swaying slightly. The elite do not walk with their feet, they walk with their pride, Madame Gable barked, striking Maya's spine with a wooden ruler as she instinctively slouched from the pain. Stand up straight. Chin up 15 degrees. A Sterling lady never looks at the ground, because there is nothing down there but trash. For the next 10 hours, the mansion became a psychological and physical torture chamber. Maya had to balance 3 heavy books on her head while walking the corridors, mastering the flawless mid-Atlantic accent of the super-rich. Every time a book fell, or a word was mispronounced, Madame Gable coldly cut an item from her dinner menu. Miss Maya, you say thank you, and I'm sorry entirely too much, Madame Gable said from the top of the stairs, looking down at a sweating, exhausted Maya. The lower class begs for approval. The elite do not need understanding. They require protocol and execution. You speak like a servant. Maya's feet began to bleed, staining the black lining of her shoes. The physical pain was draining her spirit. Yet, instead of crying or begging, Maya's eyes grew remarkably sharper as the sun went down. Every time Madame Gable raised her voice, Maya didn't look at the wooden ruler. She looked at the deep wrinkles around the woman's eyes and her white-knuckled grip on the wood. She realized something profound. This woman wasn't training her. She was projecting her own terror. Madame Gable had spent her entire life enslaved by these very rules, and she was terrified of anyone who dared to live outside them. Maya endured the bleeding feet not because she was broken, but because she was using the pain to keep her mind awake. Late that evening, Julian Sterling walked onto the second-floor balcony. He looked down at the foyer, watching Maya relentlessly practicing her stride, leaving faint, smeared traces of blood on the white marble floor with every single step. Julian swirled his scotch, his eyes darkening. He expected to see a broken puppet. Instead, he saw a spine of absolute steel being forged for a much larger war. Part 5. The unwritten lesson. By the third day, the air in the grand ballroom was suffocating. The room was set up with dozens of fragile, priceless crystal glasses imported from Italy. Maya's task was to master serving wine according to Gala standards, where a single clumsy gesture could ruin a reputation. Fill it exactly 3/4 of the way. Not a single drop must touch the rim, Madame Gable instructed, her arms crossed. Beside her, a young, newly hired maid named Lily held a silver tray with the wine bottle. Her hands were shaking violently under the housekeeper's icy glare. Smash! A deafening shatter echoed through the ballroom. The tray slipped, sending a crystal glass crashing onto the floor. Sharp shards flew everywhere. The dark red liquid pooled across the pristine white marble like an open wound. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, madam," Lily gasped, dropping to her knees in panic, tears streaming down her face as she frantically grabbed at the broken glass, ignoring the shards slicing into her skin. "You clumsy fool." Madame Gable's face darkened, raising her wooden ruler. "The Sterling estate has no room for useless people. Pack your bags and step back, Madame Gable." A calm, commanding voice cut through the panic. Ignoring her own aching feet, Maya walked over and dropped to her knees right next to Lily. To the absolute shock of both the housekeeper and the maid, a future Sterling heiress was using her bare hands to pick up the broken glass, gently stopping Lily's bleeding, trembling fingers. "Miss Maya, what do you think you are doing?" Madame Gable snapped. "Lowering yourself for the help is strictly forbidden. They do not need empathy. They need protocol and punishment so they don't repeat their mistakes." Maya stood up slowly. She looked directly into the furious eyes of the head housekeeper, her gaze sharp, calculating, and entirely devoid of malice. "You're wrong, Madame Gable. You think she messed up because she doesn't care about protocol? No, she broke the glass because she is terrified of you. You manage by fear, but fear only creates trembling hands and more mistakes. They don't fear your punishments. They fear being thrown out. They fear failing the families they support outside these iron gates." Madame Gable froze, the wooden ruler hovering uselessly in midair. For the first time in her career, someone had stripped her philosophy of power completely naked. "Managing by fear only keeps their bodies in a cage," Maya continued, her voice low but echoing through the massive room. "I lead by trust. Let's see who earns absolute loyalty, your fear or my empathy." Up on the second-floor balcony, Julian Sterling had been standing in the shadows, watching the entire scene play out. The icy, untouchable gaze of the billionaire shifted. He looked at the spilled wine on the floor, then at Maya's unyielding eyes. Julian realized that this cleaning girl wasn't just learning to play a part. She was bringing an entirely new culture, a soft, human power, into a home that had only ever known cold contracts and calculated moves. And for the first time in his life, the man who sat at the absolute top of the world felt his own armored walls beginning to crack under her light. Part 6. The moon-shaped scar. The grandfather clock in the grand library struck midnight, its heavy chimes echoing like a heartbeat through the empty corridors of the Sterling estate. Maya sat on the edge of a velvet ottoman, the heavy silk of her emerald gown pooled around her waist. She had finally slipped off the suffocating stiletto heels. Her ankles were swollen, and a thin line of dried crimson traced the side of her right arch, the price of Madame Gable's ruthless lessons. The heavy oak door creaked open. It wasn't a maid carrying a first aid kit. It was Julian. He had rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, his silk tie discarded somewhere along the way. In his hands, he held a silver bowl of warm water, a fresh linen cloth, and a bottle of antiseptic. He didn't say a word. He walked over, dropped to one knee right in front of her, and set the bowl on the floor. "Julian, you don't have to do this," Maya said softly, her voice carrying the natural warmth that the mansion had spent 3 days trying to freeze. "Send Lily. Or anyone else. Lily is asleep. And Madame Gable doesn't treat casualties," Julian replied, his voice flat, devoid of its usual Wall Street sharpness. He gently took her right ankle in his hand. His palms were surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the icy demeanor he showed the world. As he pressed the damp linen cloth against her cut, Maya winced, her fingers tightening on the velvet cushion. "Hold still," he murmured, his eyes locked entirely on his work. He wiped away the blood with meticulous, almost clinical precision. "You should have stopped walking when it started bleeding. Pride is a luxury you can't afford if it cripples you before the gala." "It wasn't pride," Maya whispered, looking down at the top of his head. From this angle, without his slicked-back hair and judgmental stare, he looked vulnerable. "I needed the pain. It reminded me of why I'm here." It reminded me of Chloe. Julian's hand froze for a fraction of a second. Then, he continued dabbing the wound. A neat trick. But out there, they don't care about your motives. They only care if you break. And what about you, Julian? Maya leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the way his jaw clenched. Who taught you not to break? Julian didn't answer. He picked up the antiseptic, poured a few drops onto a cotton pad, and pressed it against her skin. The sting was sharp, but Maya didn't make a sound. Instead, her eyes drifted to Julian's left wrist. As his sleeve shifted, she noticed a pale, jagged, moon-shaped scar cutting across his skin, partially hidden beneath his luxury watch. Before he could pull away, Maya gently reached down and caught his wrist. Her fingertips brushed against the old tissue. Julian flinched as if he had been burned. His eyes snapped up, flashing with a sudden, dangerous fury. Don't touch me. A defensive wound, Maya said softly, completely unfazed by his anger. She didn't let go. She looked directly into his icy eyes, seeing past the billionaire, past the contracts, right into the kid behind the armor. You didn't get this in a corporate boardroom. How old were you? 10. 12. You're a cleaner, Maya. Not my therapist. Julian hissed, trying to pull his hand back, but her grip was steady, anchored by an unshakable empathy. I've cleaned the houses of people like you all my life, Julian, she said, her voice dropping to a soothing, rhythmic whisper. I know how old money families work. When a child fails to meet the metric, when they don't fit the Sterling standard, they aren't comforted. They are isolated, punished, left in the dark until they learn to stop feeling. Julian's breath hitched. The muscles in his neck strained. This scar. Maya touched the moon-shaped mark again, her voice thick with absolute certainty. You got it trying to shield yourself from someone you were supposed to trust. Someone who told you that if you weren't perfect, you were nothing. You don't manage this estate with fear because you're an evil man, Julian. You do it because you're terrified that if you let down your guard for even a second, that person will come back and hurt you again. The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time in his life, Julian Sterling felt entirely, terrifyingly naked. No one had ever dared to speak to his trauma. No one had ever looked at his ruthless ambition and called it what it truly was, a shield for a broken boy. His fingers trembled against the linen cloth. A volatile mix of rage, panic, and a deep, aching relief warred in his chest. He wanted to ruin her for seeing too much, but more than that, he wanted her to keep holding his hand. Slowly, Julian let out a long, shuddering breath. He didn't pull his wrist away this time. He lowered his head, his forehead almost touching her knee, his voice cracking into a raw, barely audible whisper. If you breathe a word of this to anyone, I will destroy you. Maya smiled, a gentle, maternal warmth filling her eyes. She placed her other hand over his knuckles, securing his trembling grip. I know, she whispered, but you won't. Because for the first time in your life, Julian, somebody finally sees you. Up on the balcony, the shadows elongated. The billionaire who owned Manhattan was still on his knees, not as a master, but as a man desperately trying to remember how to breathe. Part 7. Enter the villain. The morning sun had barely cleared the tree lane of the upstate estate when the roaring purr of a custom matte black Lamborghini broke the quiet. Tires screeched violently against the cobblestone driveway. Isla Vanderbilt did not announce her arrivals. She dictated them. Before the grand mahogany doors could be fully opened by the staff, Isla swept into the foyer, her Christian Dior trench coat billowing behind her like dark wings. Her sharp, red-painted lips were pressed into a thin, predatory line. She didn't look at the servants bowing their heads. Her eyes scanned the grand staircase, searching for the anomaly she knew was hiding in Julian's house. Madame Gable, Isla snapped, tossing her leather gloves onto the silver tray. Where is Julian's new project? The little ghost he's trying to pass off as a Sterling. Before the housekeeper could answer, a soft, steady cadence of footsteps echoed from the top of the stairs. Maya descended. She wore a simple, tailored ivory dress. No jewelry, no heavy makeup, her brown hair cascading softly over her shoulders. She walked with a natural grace that didn't require the rigid tension Madame Gable had tried to force upon her. Isla's eyes narrowed, her gaze instantly locking onto Maya. She walked toward the foot of the stairs, her 5-inch stilettos clicking like a countdown. So, "This is the trash Julian dragged out of the gutter," Isla said, her voice dripping with calculated venom, loud enough for every servant in the room to hear. She stopped just 2 steps below Maya, looking up with a cold, mocking laugh. "Let's be real, darling. You can wear the silk, you can copy the accent, but you still smell like cheap bleach and poverty. You're just a sewer rat playing dress-up in a gilded cage." The air in the foyer turned to ice. Lily, standing in the corner, gripped her apron in terror. Madame Gable remained motionless, waiting for the impostor to shatter under the weight of old money cruelty. But Maya didn't break. She didn't flush with anger, nor did she raise her voice. Instead, she took the remaining 2 steps down, bringing herself eye to eye with the most dangerous woman in New York high society. Maya looked at Isla, really looked at her. She didn't see the Dior coat, the diamond-encrusted Cartier watch, or the terrifying family name. She saw the heavy, dark circles hidden beneath Isla's flawless concealer. She saw the microscopic tremor in Isla's fingers as she tightly gripped her $30,000 Hermes bag. She saw a woman weaponizing her cruelty because she was starving for something she couldn't buy. "You left Manhattan at 5:30 a.m., Isla," Maya said, her voice incredibly soft, almost tender. It wasn't the voice of a servant, nor a fake heiress. It was the voice of a mirror. "You didn't even wait for your assistant to check Julian's schedule. You drove up here yourself, speeding through the state lines, because you're terrified." Isla's mocking smile faltered, her jaw tightening. "Excuse me? You don't know anything about me, you pathetic." "I know what it looks like when someone is fighting for survival," Maya interrupted gently, stepping an inch closer. Her eyes were filled with an overwhelming, lethal track and an empathy so deep it felt like a psychological blade. "You've spent your entire life being told that if you don't marry Julian Sterling, if you don't secure this merger, your family will replace you with your younger brother. You aren't angry at me, Isla. You're desperate." "Shut up," Isla hissed, her voice cracking as a sudden flash of panic crossed her face. The servants gasped silently. Maya had just spoken the unmentionable family secret aloud. "You look at me and you see a threat, but the real threat is sitting in your family's boardroom," Maya continued, her whisper slicing through Isla's expensive armor. "You use this cruelty to prove you're strong, because you're terrified that if you show even an ounce of weakness, the world will forget you exist. It must be so exhausting to have to hate everyone just to feel safe." Isla stumbled back a half step, her breath catching in her throat. Her face turned pale. Nobody had ever dared to look past her wealth. Nobody had ever bypassed her malice to expose the raw, bleeding insecurity underneath. Maya hadn't thrown a single insult, yet she had completely dismantled the Vanderbilt heiress using nothing but the devastating weight of the truth. "Julian is mine," Isla choked out, her voice trembling with a volatile mix of rage and vulnerability. "You're nothing but a temporary puppet." "Then why are you shaking, Isla?" Maya asked softly, reaching out her hand, not to strike, but offering an open palm of peace. Before Isla could scream, a heavy, commanding voice echoed from the corridor. "That's enough." Julian stood at the entrance of the foyer, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Maya. He had witnessed the entire exchange. He saw how Maya had turned an elite bully into a terrified child without lifting a finger. The fascination in his eyes was undeniable and dangerous. Isla snatched her gloves, turning on her heel without looking at Julian. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice trembling as she fled the mansion, her grand illusion of power completely shattered by a cleaning girl's gaze. As the heavy front doors slammed shut, Julian walked over to Maya. The silence between them was thick with a new, terrifying realization. Maya wasn't just a wild card. She was a force of nature that could dismantle their entire world. Part 8. The death sentence. The storm that had been brewing over upstate New York finally broke, throwing heavy sheets of rain against the French windows of the Sterling estate. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, menacing vibration that matched the uneasy rhythm in Maya's chest. With only 48 hours left until the grand gala, the mansion was buzzing with frantic energy. Late that evening, Maya walked down the dimly lit corridor toward Julian's private study. She held a leather-bound ledger containing the guest list she had memorized, intending to clarify a few final names. As she neared the heavy oak doors, She noticed they were left slightly ajar, a thin sliver of warm light cutting across the dark carpet. She raised her hand to knock, but the sound of Julian's voice stopped her dead in her tracks. It wasn't his usual calm, businesslike tone. It was cold, analytical, the voice of a predator calculating an exit strategy. "The wedding is fully locked in," Julian said, his words slicing through the quiet room. "Ethan Thorne believes everything. The press has already swallowed the story of the long-lost Sterling heiress. The moment he signs the merger papers at the altar, the Vanderbilt family loses their leverage permanently." Maya held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stepped back into the shadows, leaning closer to the gap in the door. A second voice spoke, rough, low, and completely unfamiliar. "And what about the asset, Julian? What do we do with the girl from the Bronx once the ink is dry?" There was a heavy, suffocating pause. Maya could hear the distinct sound of ice clinking against a crystal glass inside the room. "Maya is a liability," Julian replied, his voice devoid of any warmth, any memory of the night he had knelt before her in the library. "She knows too much about the inner workings of this family. She's smart, too smart. If the board or the press ever traces her back to that hospital in the Bronx, the entire Sterling empire collapses overnight." "So, we terminate the contract?" the stranger asked. "Permanently," Julian said, his voice flatlined, chillingly precise. "The second the reception ends, a private transport will be waiting at the back entrance. She will be taken out of the country. A new identity, a closed account, and a secure facility in a remote location. She will never step foot in New York again. Maya the cleaner will cease to exist. She is going to disappear." Maya staggered back a half step, her back hitting the cold wallpaper of the corridor. The words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. She is going to disappear. Every tender moment, every lingering glance, the vulnerability he had shown when she touched his moon-shaped scar, it was all part of the calculation. He hadn't been healed by her empathy. He had merely been assessing her threat level. To a man like Julian Sterling, people weren't human beings to be understood. They were assets to be utilized and liquidated when they became a risk. For a single, terrifying moment, panic gripped her throat. She could run. She had the $50,000 for Chloe's bills secured in the hospital account. She could slip out into the rainy night, change her name, and hide in the vastness of the country. But as she looked down at her hands, the panic slowly dissolved, replaced by something cold, sharp, and terrifyingly calm. She remembered who she was. She was Maya. She had spent her entire life cleaning up the foulest messes of the elite, looking at the rot beneath their pristine floors. If she ran now, Julian would spend the rest of his life living in the prison of his own fear, destroying anyone who came too close. And she would spend hers running from shadows. "No," she thought, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, unyielding resolve. "I won't run." Maya didn't push the door open. She didn't confront him with tears or anger. Instead, she silently turned on her heel and walked back down the dark corridor, her silhouette fading into the shadows of the mansion. Julian thought he was preparing a trap to eliminate a liability. He thought he was playing the ultimate game of chess. But he forgot one crucial thing. Maya was never his puppet. She was his mirror. And at the grand gala tomorrow night, she wasn't just going to break her script, she was going to shatter his entire world to set them both free. Part 9. Truth and Liberation. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a blinding sea of white diamonds, ice sculptures, and old money arrogance. Flashbulbs exploded like a firing squad as Manhattan's elite gathered for the event of the season, the official unveiling of the Sterling Thorne merger. Maya stood at the epicenter of the room. She was breathtaking. Her emerald silk gown flowed behind her like a river of glass, her spine perfectly straight. She looked every bit the billionaire's sister. Yet, as she scanned the crowd, she felt the invisible threads of the trap tightening. From the balcony, Julian's private security team was already in position, eyes locked on her. At the bar, Julian stood with Ethan Thorne, his expression a mask of absolute, chilling indifference. He didn't look at her. The countdown to her disappearance had begun. Suddenly, the ambient chatter of the ballroom died down to a sharp, expectant hush. Isla Vanderbilt was marching across the floor, flanked by a dozen high society photographers. In her hand, she held a crystal glass filled to the brim with dark, staining Malbuck. Her eyes burned with a chaotic, desperate malice. She had been humiliated once at the estate, and tonight, she was going to reclaim her crown by tearing the impostor to shreds in front of the world. A toast, Isla announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, dripping with sweet poison. To the great Julian Sterling and his beautiful, immaculate sister. Before anyone could raise a glass, Isla lunged forward. With a vicious, deliberate flick of her wrist, she hurled the heavy red wine straight into Maya's face. The dark liquid splashed violently, dripping down Maya's forehead, soaking into the ivory skin of her neck and ruining the pristine green silk of her gown. The ballroom gasped. The paparazzi's cameras went into a frenzy, a barrage of blinding white light capturing the ultimate humiliation of the Sterling heiress. Isla laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. Oops, my hand slipped. But then again, trash belongs in the gutter, right? Julian stepped forward, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned white. His security team moved in. The script was broken. But before anyone could touch her, Maya did the one thing no one expected. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of defeat or a fake mask of politeness. It was a smile of supreme, devastating freedom. She didn't wipe the wine from her face. She let the red liquid run down her cheek like a drop of blood, turning her humiliation into a badge of unshakable dignity. She took a step closer to Isla, her eyes radiating a lethal, profound compassion. You think you've ruined me, Isla? Maya's voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it carried like thunder. You poured this wine too. Show everyone how dirty I am. But look around this room. The only thing people see right now is a woman so consumed by the fear of being forgotten that she had to turn herself into a monster just to be noticed. Isla's laughter died instantly. Her face flushed a deep, panicked red as the cameras suddenly turned away from Maya and locked onto her trembling, exposed form. Maya turned her gaze away from Isla, ignoring the elite entirely, and looked straight at Julian. She walked past the security guards, stepping directly into his space. The red wine on her dress pressed against his immaculate suit. And you, Julian, Maya whispered, her voice piercing through his billionaire armor, echoing in the quietest depths of his soul. Your transport is waiting at the back gate, isn't it? You built a perfect cage for me tonight because you think removing a liability protects your empire. Julian froze, his breath catching in his throat. His dark eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. She knew. But you aren't protecting an empire, Julian, Maya said, her voice rich with a devastating, liberating truth. You are protecting your childhood. You think that if you control every metric, if you liquidate anyone who sees the real you, you'll finally be safe from the dark. But look at yourself. You've become the very monster that hurt you. You are destroying the only person who ever truly saw you, just to keep a gilded mirror intact. Maya, stop, Julian choked out, his voice cracking, the cold Wall Street tycoon completely disintegrating before her. I won't stop, Julian, because I am already free, Maya said, her eyes shining with tears but her jaw set like iron. You can send me away. You can make Maya the cleaner disappear. But the truth is already in this room. You can either spend the rest of your life running a company built on fear, or you can have the courage to look in the mirror, break it, and finally heal that lonely boy inside. The choice is yours, but I am leaving my script behind. Without waiting for his answer, Maya turned her back on the billion-dollar merger, on the cameras, and on the security team. She walked down the center of the grand ballroom, her wine-stained gown trailing behind her like a royal cape, her head held high in absolute, unyielding dignity. She didn't use a single weapon of high society. She had used the absolute, unvarnished truth to shatter their illusions. Julian stood paralyzed in the center of the room. The cameras were flashing, his business partners were shouting, but all he could hear was the echoes of her voice. He looked down at his own hands, then at the moon-shaped scar on his wrist. For the first time in his life, the empire felt like a tomb. And for the first time in his life, he had to make a choice. Keep his crown or save his soul. Part 10. The broken mirror. The heavy rain outside the Plaza Hotel had slowed to a soft, rhythmic drizzle, washing over the slick asphalt of Fifth Avenue. Maya walked out of the grand, revolving doors alone. She didn't look back at the flashing lights or the security guards who stood frozen, unsure of their orders. She simply stepped into the cool New York night, her wine-stained emerald gown clinging to her skin, breathing in the damp, unfiltered air of the city. For the first time in a month, she didn't feel like a character in someone else's script. She was just Maya. Behind her, the grand ballroom was in absolute chaos. The merger papers sat unsigned on the mahogany table. Corporate lawyers were shouting into their phones, and the Vanderbilt empire was scrambling to contain the public relations disaster of the century. But Julian Sterling wasn't listening to any of them. He stood in the center of the frantic room, staring at the empty doorway where Maya had just exited. Her words still hung in the air, vibrating like an unspoken judgment. You are destroying the only person who ever truly saw you, just to keep a gilded mirror intact. His assistant rushed up to him, iPad in hand, his voice panicked. Mr. Sterling, the board is calling an emergency meeting. The stock is dropping 2 points already. We need to issue a statement immediately, and the transport at the back gate. Should they intercept her? Julian looked down at his assistant. He looked at the frantic, terrified faces of the executives around him. Then, he looked at his own reflection in the towering, gold-framed mirror on the ballroom wall. He saw a man worth billions, surrounded by everything money could buy, yet completely, utterly hollow. He was still that 12-year-old boy, hiding in the dark, using a fortress of numbers and contracts to keep the world away. Slowly, a profound, quiet calm washed over Julian's face. The tension that had held his jaw rigid for 15 years finally dissolved. No, Julian said, his voice quiet but carrying an unshakable weight that instantly silenced the executives around him. Sir, the assistant blinked, confused. No statement. Cancel the transport, Julian said, slipping his hand into his pocket and pulling out his sleek, custom fountain pen, the tool he had used to sign away lives and buy empires. He dropped it casually onto the floor, letting it roll away into the spilled wine. Cancel the merger. Call the board and tell them I resign. Effective immediately, before anyone could scream, Julian turned his back on the Sterling empire. He unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, pulled off his diamond cufflinks, and tossed them onto a passing waiter's tray. He walked out of the ballroom, his footsteps steady, leaving the panic behind him. He ran down the stone steps of the hotel and out into the New York drizzle. He didn't care about his bespoke suit or his polished shoes. He scanned the crowded sidewalk, his heart pounding with a raw, terrifying emotion he hadn't felt since childhood: hope. He found her half a block away, standing near a subway entrance, looking at the city lights. Maya turned around. Her breath hitched slightly as she saw Julian running toward her, his hair damp from the rain, his billionaire armor completely stripped away. He stopped just a foot away from her, chest heaving, his dark eyes vulnerable and completely exposed. You left your script, Julian said, his voice trembling as he held up his left wrist, exposing the pale, moon-shaped scar to the open night air. You were right, Maya. I was a coward. I built a cage and called it an empire. But I don't want to live in the dark anymore. Maya looked at him, her eyes softening as she saw the profound transformation taking place right in front of her. The cold tycoon was gone. Standing before her was a man who had finally found the courage to break his own mirror. What about your company, Julian? She whispered. What about everything you built? It wasn't an empire, it was a tomb, Julian replied, a genuine, beautiful smile breaking across his face for the first time. He stepped closer, gently taking her hand, not to control her, but to anchor himself to her truth. I gave it up. All of it. I don't want to manage people with fear anymore. I want to learn how to lead by trust. I want to build something real. With you. Maya looked down at their joined hands. The cleaning girl from the Bronx and the former king of Wall Street, standing on a rainy New York sidewalk, completely equal. They hadn't built a fake identity to trick the high society. Instead, they had destroyed the high society's illusions to build a new culture. A culture where human beings were finally seen as human beings, where dignity couldn't be bought, and where the truth was the ultimate power. Julian wrapped his coat around her wine-stained shoulders, and together, they walked down into the subway station, disappearing into the heartbeat of the real city. Julian thought he had hired an actress to play a part, but in the end, he had invited a guide into his soul. The gilded mirror was shattered, and beneath the broken shards, they had finally found the truth.